Floats are used for layout setout, and in this lesson we're going to be covering what floats do and how they work within the web page. So going into our style sheet that's linked to the HTML document. So the float property specifies how an element should float and be positioned within the container. So I do have an image on the page that we've added, and it's within a paragraph tag, and it's sitting within some text content. We'll go over to the HTML. I'm also going to add in some text content on the other side as well, on the left side of it. So it's going to be placed relatively in the center of the text content. And we can use float to float the image to either the left side or the right side of the container that's contained within. So let's make a selection of the image. It's sitting in within the class of test1, and apply this property to all of the image tags that are going to be contained within text1. Selecting the image and applying the float property. So let's first float it to the left-hand side, see what happens, and we do a refresh. So it floats it to the left-hand side. Notice how the text is wrapping around it. We also have an option to float it to the right-hand side, and floating it to the right, we'll move it over to the right-hand side with the text wrapping around it. The default is going to be none, and float is often used to specify where the image is going to be in relation to the text in the container that's surrounding it. So float does affect the following elements, and that's why we need to use clear in order to clear any of the floats that we might have set, as the elements that are listed afterwards could get affected by the float property in this element. And that's why we use clear. So after we use the float property, we could also adjust the parent element overflow. So selecting test1, let's apply the overflow property to it, and I'll set the overflow property to auto. So that will adjust the size of the element where the image that's being floated is positioned. I also add a background color to it so that we can distinguish where the element starts and stops. So that's the test parent element. So let's set a width value for it, and I'll float this element to the left-hand side. Update a background image of blue for it. So we're looking at the blue element. So it's floating over to the left-hand side, and then automatically the next element is taking the available spacing. And this is because the float is applied to test 2, and we don't have anything for test 3. So even if you were to go and remove the width, the float would still be in place, and it would still take up whatever the available width is of the content that's contained within that element. So that's why typically when you are using floats, you do use width so that you can set a certain width value for that element. Let's also show you and demo how we can use for the next element. So these are all the different sections that we have. So we've given them a class of test 1, 2, 3. So selecting that next one, we're going to apply the clear property. And you have an option to either clear the left, right, clear none, or clear both. So I'm going to do a clear of both, and we'll see what changes now. So now that the heading 3 is appearing where it normally would have been, even though that the spacing for H2 is taken up there. So it's allowing it to take whatever was previously available, and with H3 by default we were going all the way across. So the clear is the way to fix any of the float issues that you have with elements that might be coming after the element that you've applied the float to. I'll also set up a background color for this. And if we set a width for this element, so I'm going to set it at 500 pixels as well. And instead of floating it to the left, how about we float it over to the right-hand side? So this is how we can begin to position content on the page. I'll also resize it to be smaller. So if we wanted to float a number of these sections on a page, and we want to create a website that had one navigation bar across, one section that was full across, and then a few sections that were maybe a 3-column website section, and then a footer at the bottom, we can do all of that by applying floats, and content properties that we've learned in the earlier lessons. So try out floats, and in the next lesson we've got an exercise using floats to design a web page. So that's coming up next.